Welcome to the Agile Career Podcast, where we will take you on the journey from employed for life to employable for life. We'll give you the tips, insights, and strategies to help you build the transferable skills that you'll need. So let's get started. Please welcome your host, Günther Richter.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to the Agile Career Podcast. This is episode 12, and as usual, I'm really glad that you can join me in this episode. Before we go on with the episode, I would just like to say Happy Father's Day to the dads out there. I realize it's not Father's Day in every country. There seems to be a kind of discrepancy between different countries, but if it is Father's Day where you live, then I would just like to wish all the dads Happy Father's Day. I got a lovely card from my son this morning, my 12-year-old son, one of those ones that brings tears to your eyes and kind of, you know, makes you reflect on the privileges of being a father. So yes, Happy Father's Day to everyone. I hope you have a fantastic day today and get spoiled by your family, of course. So in episode 12, we are going to talk about going solo. And in this episode, I am joined by Peter Robinson, who has spent more than 20 years in a corporate career and decided at a point it was time to set out on his own, chart his own course, and established himself as a consultant with a consultancy. And he's going to talk a little bit more about that in the interview. He's going to talk about his corporate career, of course, and the skills he learned and those sorts of things. And, you know, also how he made that transition, which is often a scary one, going from employed in the corporate world to becoming self-employed. So before we start with the interview, just a reminder, if you are enjoying the show, please subscribe. It's available on all platforms, so you can listen on your favorite platform: Apple Podcasts, Google, Stitcher, Deezer, Spotify. There's a whole host of them out there. So please subscribe. And if you're enjoying the show, please leave a review. I would really appreciate you leaving a review. That would really be great. So without further ado, let's crack on. Hello, Peter. Welcome to the Agile Career Podcast. I'm really glad to have you on the show today.
Good afternoon. Very pleased to be here as well.
I'm really glad you could join us on the show. And as you'll know, and the listeners will know, that each show we have a bit of a theme, and we try and build the sort of questions and the insight we gain around a theme. And I thought, and you know, from discussing this with you previously, that a good theme to use on this show was the sort of going solo theme. And, you know, looking at your career, you've made a move, I think, a few times between a corporate environment and you know, going off and launching your own business. So I was really keen to draw some insights into those events and, you know, the thinking and how you moved and transitioned between those different jobs and bits of your career. But I guess without jumping into the detail, I'll, you know, let you introduce yourself first and, you know, talk a little bit about what it is you do now and, you know, perhaps how you ended up there.
So, hi, I'm Peter Robinson. I have my own IT consultancy business called HITS, HITS. And the background or what HITS is all about is it's about providing IT strategy to SME-sized businesses. So that's working predominantly, I guess, with the C-suite in those organizations, and it's the type of organization that perhaps can't quite yet afford a full-time IT director, CTO, and giving them the ability to buy in some experience for X, Y days per annum to build a strategy to allow growth of the business, savings, understand what the big topics, etc., are from an IT point of view at that particular point in time, and then work with the businesses to see how I can help them on a journey and deliver some value to them.
And I think, you know, looking at your corporate career, that plays, you know, straight into the strengths that you developed and the sorts of things you're doing in the corporate world, you know, very much aligned to the work you were doing at Specsavers, I think, and at Dixons Carphone. And, you know, so obviously like a natural progression and, you know, bringing those, as you say, to the sort of SME world. But I guess thinking back to perhaps school and some of your studies, I think you focused on business studies at first. Is that correct?
Yeah, I guess I you know, my entrance to IT is very non-traditional. So, you know, I'm not a coder. perish the thought that I would do any code at all. Actually, people would laugh at the thought of me coding. So my IT background was always to do on the business side, so building on the strengths of that university degree course, and understanding what IT can deliver to a business. So always with that business lens on it, as opposed to a technical lens. But taking then those ideas and the strategy from a business point of view, and then working with IT colleagues to understand either what in-house teams can do to build solutions, or alternatively going out to the market and seeing what's out there to deliver some requirements in that way. And I think one of the things that I've obviously had to learn is sufficient technical capability to be able to challenge people on the IT side in enough detail to know that what's being suggested and recommended by them is credible and fit for purpose for that size of organization.
And that's a good point. I mean, as you say, you wouldn't class yourself as technical in the sense that you can code or develop applications, but you needed to develop that knowledge to obviously apply it, to challenge people, to lead people. At what point did you start developing that technical knowledge? I mean, was it out of school? What was your thinking around leaving school and starting your career?
I kind of fell into IT. I didn't leave university and go, I'm going to rock into IT. When I joined Specsavers as soon as I left university, and I actually started out on the retail side for the business. So I worked in stores from a retail management point of view, and that gave me this kind of interest in getting what business needed to succeed. And then I was given an opportunity from the Specsavers group to go and join a project which was all around stock management. And I was working with the IT function, and it just clicked for me, to be brutally honest. It was not by desire or anything like that. It just clicked. And I suddenly realized that I had a capability to translate business needs into IT speak, and vice versa, turn the IT technical stuff into simple business language that people could understand. And then I found a job called business analyst. And that was kind of, so there is an IT job, or maybe it's a business job, or maybe it's an IT job. But I found that, and that was the kind of the sweet spot that then launched me into whatever it is, 20, 25 years of IT.
And you make a good point there. I think, often thinking about the title business analyst, there's that perception that it's entirely business. But as you say, it's having that ability to straddle both the business and the technical worlds, and, understand what it is that business is wanting, yet at the same time understand how the technology works and how technologists deliver these sorts of solutions. So I'm really glad you mentioned that role, because it's come up in a number of interviews, and a number of guests have talked about that type of role. And it really seems to be, in many cases, whichever way you're moving, a pivotal role in terms of building your career. But I think then talking about developing those technical skills, so I guess at the time when you made the move, when you were working on that stock management system, did you think there's a whole lot I have to learn about IT and technology?
I think you need to kind of get credibility on both sides suddenly. You need to have your business credibility so that the people who you've kind of left to go to, quote, the dark side of IT still understand you and all of that kind of stuff. And then you need to learn a whole new set of credibility with your IT colleagues, so that, they know when you're challenging them and asking them questions, you've got sufficient background and understanding of what they're talking about, that, they can appreciate the challenges and the questions that you're going to ask, and, they don't give you the shoulder, as it were, and ignore the challenges that you wanted. I was going to use a different term then, but I'll keep it clean for the sake of it. But it's about talk, I remember having a conversation with somebody about, not in my early days, but later on about, the cloud and capacity and all of this kind of thing. And we had a long debate, and they were coming up with the project that we were working on at the time. This was at Specsavers. We needed to make sure it would scale properly. And I had a long chat with the enterprise architect and was really pushing them around what they were talking about from a cloud point of view. And for the first half, they were kind of being a little bit slarmy and sarcastic and thinking, yeah, he doesn't know what he's talking about. And then suddenly, after a couple of killer questions, you could see them, that there was that, he does know what he's talking about kind of moment. And then suddenly the conversation changed. And from that moment on, with that individual, the conversations were very, very different. And it takes time. And as the technologies move on, of course, you've got to keep building your skill set. You've got to keep your own learning up to date and that kind of stuff. And I think that's one of the challenges that I face, now, is to make sure that I keep the skill set fresh and what the key challenges are around today, as opposed to 5-10 years ago.
And what sort of approaches do you find have worked well to keep those skills relevant or current?
Yeah, that's a killer question. That is. Thanks. I do quite a bit of reading. I have a fantastic networking group that I link into with a lot of senior IT professionals. And through that, I attend quite a lot of network dinners, webinars, and just try and soak in things. And I think it's about talking, and especially within the network group. The group is probably 500-600 senior IT professionals, and you can get hold of them and you just say, hey, I've got X problem. Can you help me? And somebody will almost certainly always respond and say, yeah, we've just done that in our organization. Give me a call. Let's talk it through. And it's accepting that you don't know everything and being comfortable enough to reach out to individuals and say, hey, help me, please.
Yeah, there's some great nuggets there. And I think particularly the networking one, I guess many people don't want to generalize, but predominantly technical roles kind of don't feel comfortable networking. A lot of people just like to get to the heart of the matter of the discussion. They don't want to do the chitty chatty and, the water cooler talk and all of that kind of stuff. And I know networking is a lot more than just that, but I think people are hesitant to do that, but don't equally so don't realize the value there is to networking. And, in any industry, whether it's technology, whether it's business or finance or whatever, it's such a valuable thing. So I'm really glad you drew that out there. And I think the other nugget that you landed was, accepting the things that you don't know, identifying those, but, reaching out, taking that step to ask for help to close that gap.
Yeah, you're right. When I say I won't class myself as a techie, obviously I'm very close to being a techie. And you're right, all the classic jokes about, keep them in a darkened room and just open the door and feed them pizza and all of that kind of stuff. I get all of that. And yes, it sometimes it really isn't in people's comfort zones and stuff like that. But I think once you start doing it, I can still remember vividly the first time I joined this network group for dinner. And, I must say the first couple of glasses of wine were really appreciated them just to relax me a little bit. But, we sat down in a room, there was 20, 25 of us. You got chatting to the guy next to you. The subject matter was interesting because that's what I'd signed up for. And suddenly 3 hours had gone. And I learned so much. And actually, do you know what? It wasn't a problem. And you've just got to take that leap and not feel that you are when you walk into that room, you are, you might be the new kid, as it were, but you're not necessarily inferior to anyone else in that room. They all have their own individual skill sets. It's as likely they'll come and ring you up for something as you will ring up for them something from them in the future.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And I mean, a lot of it is confidence, but as you say, you might be the stranger in the room or the newbie, and it's feeling that you've also got something to contribute. And it's I guess it's those relationships that stuff gets passed both ways, and everyone's going to benefit from it. So yeah, the networking that comes up in almost every conversation that I have with guests on the show. So yeah, I can't emphasize that enough. And I think what you've just described is a real testament to how well it works.
Oh, absolutely, 100%.
So I mean that was some really good advice in terms of growing, I guess, those not only technical skills, but where you saw there were gaps or you needed to stay current with technology and that sort of thing. Looking at your career in Specsavers, then I guess that was also, you were at Specsavers for many years. You progressed through the organization. I guess, probably more away from a hands-on kind of role, more into a leadership role. How did you find that transition, growing those leadership skills and having to probably work more with people in a leadership context rather than just a pure colleague context?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I think, I was at Specsavers for 21 and a half years, arguably too long, but I loved the business, and the business was very entrepreneurial at the time, and there were always new challenges, and that's what kept me there as long as it did. I guess just like many organizations, and it's still true today, is when you take that first move from being a doer into management and then into leadership, I wasn't given any proper training. You're suddenly managing your colleagues, and then 3-4 years later you're leading a team or something like that. And I think I guess to start with, it was very much learning by my own mistakes, and of course I made quite a few of those. You develop your own style ultimately, and you realize what works, one, for you, but two, more importantly, I think, for the team. And my experience now with working with different teams in different organizations, both in contract roles and perm roles, is, as a leader, to get the best out of that team, you've got to adapt to the team, not necessarily the other way round. If you want to get the best out of the individual, you've got to find out what that individual makes that individual tick, and then deal with that. And yes, you've got to have a degree of control across the whole team and manage the team in a way so that everyone understands that. But I still think there's very much a personal touch. And, one of the things that I think is one of my key strengths is the way that I kind of try and get almost a personal engagement and something to work with personally about every member of the team. So take some time to find out about them, so that when you do, and it's very, very common in IT, when you get to that point of delivery, when you need that extra 5, 10, 20% from somebody, you get it without asking. You don't say, we got to work through the night tonight. They know, and they know you'll be with them doing that. And I think if that's what I think leadership's about, is creating that kind of personal thing with them so that it just happens. And as I say, if my experience is, if I've done it right, when push comes to shove, I don't need to ask them. They've already started doing it. All I need to do is open the door and provide the pizza and the coffee.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think, if you can get to a point where people are doing the things because they want to, not because they've been told to do them or been asked to do them, I think that's probably that transition from management to leadership. And, it's a good distinction between the two. So that's a great bit you've drawn out there. What would you say your biggest surprise was making that transition, so sort of moving into that leadership role? What was your biggest surprise?
I think it's how much I knew without knowing I knew it, if that makes sense. It's the bit where you go, crumbs, right, I'm now, I had a role at Specsavers where the business really started to hit the ground with what's now Specsavers Hair Care. And at the time I was head of IT for Hair Care at Specsavers, and there was a business opportunity and the IT was awful. We were running £25 million business at the time on a 70-column Excel spreadsheet. And we knew we needed something a little bit better. And it was, working with the business and then leading the IT guys. Once I'd got clarity from the business, it was interesting how much I knew instinctively and how much the experience of, in my case, starting as a business analyst, but then managing a team of business analysts and growing that way, how much that instinctively allowed me to lead in that particular area as well and ask the right questions.
That's a great point. Often when I have discussions with people about or talk about transferable skills, they struggle to, I guess, identify those transferable skills or don't know that they have them. And I guess it's in situations like you've just described when you're tested, I guess, you instinctively do something and you think, well, I haven't consciously gone and learned that, but I've developed the skill somewhere. So I think, if people can kind of draw out those sorts of skills and understand what those are, those are the skills that'll serve them well, moving as you did, progressing through the organization, and then also onto your next role at your next organization, onto your next career even.
Yeah. And one of the things I think that you worry about, and I certainly did, was when I was at Specsavers, is 20 years in an organization, you struggle, and I struggled probably from in the early time of leaving there. I was thinking, well, what's my worth? What do I know? And you've no appreciation of how transferable a load of the skills that you have actually are. And there was a gap, but when I walked into Dixons Carphone, it was like, within I remember making the first management decision at 4:00 in the afternoon on the first day. And it was like, wow, value. I can add value straight away. This is fantastic. But when you've spent 20 odd years in the same place, you think, oh my God, what am I worth outside in the market? And I think that's the other big takeout for me is any role, any business, you're going to develop transferable skills. Just be confident in yourself.
That's an excellent bit of advice. And I mean, in terms of thinking about that, was it, I guess, moving on from Specsavers, so you said you were there 20 odd years, you made the statement of saying it was probably too long, but I guess thinking about those things you learned, was there a moment of introspection where you asked yourself, what am I worth, or what is it that I know? Or did that surface more organically?
I mean, it was twofold. I think, one of the things that obviously you spend 20 odd years in an organization, and especially, an IT function, you go through quite a few CIOs, CTOs in that period of time. And from a personal point of view, I knew that business inside out both at a business level and also from what the IT systems were doing. And I kept getting overlooked for what I thought were promotions I should be getting. I didn't get what I wanted out of Specsavers, and it frustrated me. And the other thing I realized was actually the organization was changing, and it was changing in such a way that not that perhaps I realized that the bits that I'd really, really enjoyed about Specsavers were now few and far between. So I needed a different challenge. And it was those kind of two, you keep getting overlooked. So lovely platitudes talk to you about there, but you never got there. And do you know what? Actually, this business is changing. And the bits, the entrepreneurial bit, the just get on and deliver bit, you're really empowered, changed. And process and more process came along. And in my mind, that started to impact delivery. And, you know, I kept thinking there were people in that organization who were there and they weren't adding value. They were just there as a barrier to stopping me delivering. And that was when I thought, yeah, I've got to go.
Okay, so I guess that came to its natural conclusion. What did you envision for yourself then? What was the next step?
Do you know, I didn't know. If I'm brutally honest, I didn't know at all. I came out of Specsavers and, you know, I knew my time was done. And it was very much a case of, let me take some time away, because 21 odd years is a long time. We had some personal stuff that we needed to do. So my mother needed a bit of extra care. So that was suddenly a bigger priority for a period of time. But that also gave me a time for reflection and working out what I wanted. I knew I wanted to stay in retail. But that was really about it. So, you know, it was a case of time out. When the timeout's done, look for retail roles.
And that led you on to your next role at Dixons Carphone?
Yeah, it did. Yeah, and you know, that was interesting. You know, I went from a business turning over £3 billion, Specsavers, to a business turning over £10 billion.
That's a
And
significant jump.
Significant. And, you know, I had a fantastic role at Dixons Carphone. So, you know, I was in charge of retail applications. And so I had the roadmap for all the store applications in Carphone warehouse stores, Curry's PC World stores, Dixons Travel. So a nice large portfolio. I had a large offshore team who were delivering projects, etc. But I hit the same challenges around governance. In fact, they were worse at Dixons Carphone in many respects. And they needed to be, because it's a bigger organisation. Simple as that.
And I mean, I guess depending on the time you joined, because there was obviously a lot of change in the organization, there was the acquisition or the merger between Curry's PC World and Carphone. I guess there was a lot of disruption in the business. Was it around about the same time you joined, or had that already happened?
That had just finished. So I was actually the first IT employee for the brought in after the consolidation, but it was still, the IT function was still very much treated as Dixons people, Carphone warehouse people. You know, they had two CIOs for a period of time, for example. It was only as I left 2 years later that actually there was some proper momentum around the consolidation of applications, for example. So they were still treated very much as two organisations. And one of my big challenges was trying to work across both organisations with different teams and then a consolidated team.
And I guess technologies aside, different cultures as well, as you said. I guess you would find that as being one of the prevalent challenges, probably.
Yeah. Much more, you know, Specsavers is family-run business. They were moving to corporate. Dixons Carphone, very heavily corporate. You know, a lot of focus on the stock market and delivering for shareholders. Never ever encountered that as Specsavers. So fascinating for me personally to be able to have worked in two large organizations, but culturally totally different.
That's a good point. I think, when you're in those smaller organizations, not necessarily family owned, but, small, it's quite visible. I find it's easy to see, this is why we're doing these things, and, we're doing this work for the owners of this business. It's very, I don't want to say transparent. That's probably the wrong word, but it's very obvious why you're doing the things you need to do. And, making that transition to that more corporate environment where it's these faceless shareholders, I guess, it's often difficult thinking, what impact am I having in terms of the stuff I do on a day-to-day basis on those shareholders, and how do those decisions around, I suppose, shareholder value and driving share price, how do those filter down to me and my day-to-day job?
Yeah, and I guess from a Specsavers point of view, I was very lucky. I grew up with that company. When I started, they turned over £100 million. That was their turnover. And they had less than 100 stores. When I left, 1,500 stores, 2 billion, 2.5 billion turnover. So I grew with them. So as the emphasis and the ethos of the company changed, I kind of changed with that. In Dixons, I was suddenly jettisoned in effect, into a big corporate with a totally different set of values, principles, etc., to work on. And so, yeah, get it. And, it is a different mindset working with a group of people when it's shareholders as opposed to a family run business and all of that. And it puts me personally now in my current career from a contracting consultancy type business, it puts me in a really good position to have experienced both and be able to put the empathy properly in both areas.
Yeah, I think you've drawn out a very important term there, and that's empathy. And it relates back to some of the stuff you spoke about earlier in terms of your dealing with people, even in that leadership role. Ultimately, it's people you're dealing with, and being able to have that empathy for not only colleagues and stakeholders, obviously customers as well, but kind of, I guess, all stakeholders in the business. That's a really good point.
Yeah, it is. And I think, let's not confuse empathy with not delivering, because ultimately we are paid on what we actually deliver. And, there was always, has been and always will be for me, a focus on delivery. And, if you can do it with a smile on your face and making a personal connection with people and creating a bit of empathy with them, cutting them a bit of slack when they need a bit of slack, it doesn't make the job easier.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you say, it's not, don't confuse empathy with sympathy, for example. I think, you just described, you can be a good leader, you can do a good job and be a good person. So that's a good takeaway there. Comparing the two organizations, I guess you obviously spoke about the difference between, obviously, in turnover, a bit of culture. What were the other key differences that really challenged you, that made you think there might be areas you needed to develop in?
So I go back to a point I've already made. The benefit from Specsavers is I knew the business. I'd grown up with the business. I knew the stakeholders. I knew a lot of the stakeholders really well. I knew the founder of Specsavers personally, which cut me a bit of slack as well every now and again when I needed it. In Dixons Carphone, I came in and I knew nobody. There was no ex-Specsavers colleagues there that I could relate to and pick up. I was in a team that, I think on the second week I started, we started to 2P a load of people over to Accenture, because we started to close down part of the Dixon side of the business. So there were some big challenges as soon as I walked in the door, not necessarily technological challenges, but on a people side. But we had to keep delivering. And I think the other difference is, Dixons Carphone, because of the website, is very much a 24/7 business. Specsavers isn't. It may be in the context that there's Specsavers stores down in Australia, so yes, they trade 24/7, and service desks will follow the sun, for example. But you could turn off. In Dixons Carphone, the challenge was very different, because if the website was down,
You're losing
that
money.
was money gone. Yeah, there was somebody who would walk up to you and say, website's down, that's costing us X £1,000 an hour in lost revenue. What are we doing about it? And, that was a bit of a different culture shock, because it was very much, and it's that ethos, it's that, to me, a lot of that was around that shareholder value all the time, because you were forever being, when there was a problem, and I had service as one of my areas in the stores. So if we had a problem with our PDQ machines, etc., that was my problem. You got a real, much more, put under much more pressure to resolve it quickly than perhaps you would have done in Specsavers, because it was just more of a commercial organisation and more mature in that context as well.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, and I think so. I guess then, having made that transition, and you are now in the Dixons Carphone world, you were there for a couple of years. How did your thinking develop in terms of how you intended to grow your career? Was it going further at Dixons, or when did that entrepreneurial bug start biting again?
I realised probably after about a year that I'd probably made a mistake joining Dixons Carphone. And the mistake was the business was too big for me. What I like to do is deliver. And what I found with Dixons Carphone was, because of the size of the organisation, there was a lot of governance. And it clicked for me that actually I work better where there are lower levels of governance and there's more more opportunity to just get on and deliver. That's not to say that I don't do governance. That's very incorrect. I've put in ITIL, for example, in places and made sure it's worked. But it just struck me as it's too big. I'm not getting the kick that I get out of delivery. And so after about a year, I started tentatively looking for something else. At the time, it was another permanent role, but in a smaller organisation. And then after just under 2 years, they needed to do a round of redundancies, and I was put up at risk of redundancy. And to be brutally honest, I did a little dance of joy when they told me I was at risk of redundancy. I was actually coming back from a ski trip with a load of friends when I took the phone call, and I walked back into the room where we were having a beer, and I said, the next round's on me, because I'm being made redundant. And it was great, because I knew it wasn't right for me. And then it was, I've got a couple of very good personal friends through a previous organisation that I belonged to that I know you know a lot about, called Round Table. And I was talking to a couple of them, and one of them said, why don't you look about going on alone? Why don't you look about setting yourself up? And I thought long and hard about that for a bit and went, do you know what? You're right. And that was, at that point, HITS Consultancy was born. And fortunately for me, very quickly, I got a couple of paid gigs through that, just doing a bit of, I worked for a very small business who were looking at a very clever tool that they wanted to launch in the retail world, and they didn't quite know how to approach retailers to do this. So they came and saw me, and I worked with them for 2 or 3 months to help launch the product with them. And so I was very fortunate. I got some work straight away, which clearly helps.
It does. I think there's a few things I want to draw on there, and I think the first bit is, when we started the conversation, you described to me your current role, running Hits the consultancy. You described the sort of niche that it focused on, and as we've gone through the discussion, I think the bits have started falling into place. In terms of you saying, well, you figured out that Dixons Carphone was too big for you. You preferred working in a smaller environment. You preferred seeing the difference you made, being able to deliver, rather than going through masses of bureaucracy and governance. And it's been quite clear about these bits coming together now. And I think, thinking about the things that you enjoy doing, thinking about the things that you do well, and then popping in the third circle into the Venn diagram, things that can make you a living, to find that niche, I think is really important. And, it's come together quite nice. And as we've been talking through the story. So, I think that's an important thing to draw out to the listeners. And often people think, they often think, what am I good at? Whatever it is you're going into, I want to be an ice hockey player, or I want to be a footballer, or I want to be a lawyer. And, with the exception of probably the 2%, there's always going to be someone who's a better footballer, or a better sprinter, or a better hockey player, or a better lawyer. And I think it's through a combination of skills that you can, define what your value add is, so taking those bits as you've described, packaging those and saying, this is what I'm really good at. So I think that's really drawn out really nicely. And the other thing, and I'm glad you mentioned Roundtable. I think obviously when you talk about Roundtable, lots of people think it's the secret handshake, and there's this big air of mystery around it, but absolutely it's not. I mean, it's predominantly a networking, I suppose, or social organization. And what I'll do is I'll post a link in the show notes so listeners can find out more about Roundtable. But I think what many people find joining an organization like Roundtable, or in fact Rotary or Lions or Toastmasters, is those organizations help you develop skills that you might not necessarily be developing in the workplace. You might develop those later, but things like presentation skills, speaking in public, chairing a meeting. If you think starting off your career, whether you're out of school, college, or university, it's probably going to be a while before you chair a formal meeting in the work environment. But almost, at Roundtable, you get those opportunities straight away. And so that's definitely something I'd recommend for people to develop those skills that you can then take back to the workplace and apply in the workplace.
No, I absolutely agree. And you're quite right. There's nothing hones your meeting management skills than doing a roundtable event where there's a group of 15, 20 blokes and they all have something to say at the same point in time, and you're trying to control it. And invariably they might have had a beer or two as well. So nothing helps you hone those skills around an emotional meeting at work around a particular challenging project or whatever than doing that kind of thing. So yeah, I totally agree. I'm very, very grateful to Roundtable. I think I was in it for 12 years and I had a fantastic time. Absolutely loved it. And as I say, got certainly built up a network of lifelong friends as a consequence of that, who have been invaluable to me as well from a business point of view, in terms of, when you've got an idea and you want to pick a brain or something, one of those guys will be very, very brutally honest with you as well about whether it's a good one or a bad one.
Yeah, and Roundtable is how we met. So, again,
Yeah,
testament to the sort of power of networking and relationships. So, and then the next point that I wanted to draw out was your view, or the way you talked about, redundancy. And I think, I don't think I've spoken to one person who's been made redundant who has been upset by it. It's possibly sometimes a bit of a knee-jerk reaction, or upsetting at first, I think. But, everyone that's gone through that sort of experience has described it as, this really moved me on to the next level, or got me going in the next bit of my career, or sort of accelerated my thinking, or, really just kind of threw me into the middle of the road and got me thinking. So And as you say, it was I guess the vehicle then to take you on to what you're doing now, to launch your own consultancy. And yeah, I mean, I guess it comes with its additional challenges. So moving on from the corporate world into the world of self-employed, what would you say then those lessons have been? Because that's quite a big transition, I think, from a corporate environment to self-employed.
I think first of all, you know, if you're faced with redundancy, and I think it's really, really pertinent, you know, here we are, June 2020, there's a lot of people who are going to be made redundant as a consequence of COVID-19. And the first comment I would say is, do not be scared. Do not be scared. It is not the end of the world. I've been coaching quite a few of my ex-Specsavers colleagues because they've just announced a relatively large redundancy there. So I've been supporting them. I've been taking a few phone calls, helping a couple of people with their CVs because they haven't done a CV for 15 years or so, 10, 15 years. So the first thing I say, don't be scared about it. It's an opportunity. You know, fingers crossed it will come with an amount of money. My view is use some of that money to take the time out to think about what you really want in life, because it is an opportunity, and please don't waste it. If you roll into them what I personally did, yeah, it's scary. You know, suddenly you're selling yourself. You're the brand. The brand isn't Dixons Carphone. It's not Carphone Warehouse. It's not Specsavers. It's Peter Robinson, Hits Limited. Yeah. So suddenly, and you have to think about that. You have to think about all you do and go, and actually, you know, if somebody researches me on Facebook or Twitter or whatever, am I comfortable with what I'm writing about? When I put something on LinkedIn, am I comfortable with what I'm writing on LinkedIn? And you do suddenly have to think the company is your brand. And that's a scary thought. And that for me needed quite a bit of reflection. And you've got to learn to market yourself. You've got to learn to turn around and you know, roll back to what we talked about earlier around networking. You know, you're going to have, you know, and in a technical type role, it's going to make you feel uncomfortable at certain times. So you've got to learn to live with that being uncomfortable. And, you know, you might outwardly look like you're really an outgoing person and, you know, all of that kind of good stuff. Inwardly, I still find it quite hard. When I meet new people, inwardly, it takes an awful lot sometimes to go and shake a hand in a big room of people and go, hi, I'm Peter. You know, I've got my own IT consultancy business. Let me talk to you a little bit about that. That's hard. Really, really hard. But when you start to deliver in an organization, it's really interesting, where you can see how you can add value very, very quickly. And that builds a confidence, obviously, for next time.
You know, I like the point you've really made, or you've made about, I guess, selling yourself. And many people that are about to, or I guess are thinking about making that transition to self-employed or contracting, think, well, I can't sell, you know, I can't sell myself. But I guess put yourself in your shoes when you were applying for a job anywhere, you know, whether it was your job at Specsavers or Dixons, you were in effect selling yourself. There's slightly more, I guess it's, I wouldn't say more at risk, but it's a different context now. But I think if people can kind of draw on that experience of going for job interviews and having those conversations with a potential employer, take those skills and apply them in this situation.
Yeah, you're right. You're almost going to an interview every day.
Yeah.
I think is the way to think about it is, you know, you've got to make sure that you shave every day, for example. You don't know when you go somewhere what's the output of that. You know, you could be out with some friends and you get chatting to somebody new. Tomorrow that's a business opportunity, and you've got to be ready for that kind of thing. And yeah, it's quite exciting. It's quite exciting.
Yeah, no, that's really good advice. And I think the other thing that's become apparent is we traditionally tend to think of stability in large organizations and corporate jobs and these sorts of things. And especially as we've seen now with COVID-19, there is no such thing as a job for life. And, that's part of really why I started this podcast, was because I think people are realizing that, we don't have the same roles our parents had, and, those long careers. So I think it's certainly having people realize that, yes, it is risky running your own business or starting off on your own or going contracting, but equally so, there's an element of risk working at a corporate as well. So, as you say, it's scary, but not as bad as you think.
No, I 100% agree. I have two teenage daughters, and one's just finished her A levels. And if she would listen to me, my advice to her would be, when you start your career, look, no matter how much you enjoy an individual company, look to change roles every 5 years. And if you suddenly, that will, give you a great level of experience, that if you ever want to move and create your own business, doing whatever you want, that'll be a great foundation for it. And never be afraid to take that time out to step back and go, what do I want? We spend way too much time at work to not enjoy what we do. Way too much time.
Yeah, that's an awesome takeaway, and I'm really glad you brought that up. Talking about giving your 18-year-old daughter career advice, and you say, if kids would listen, but sort of maybe playing that question back to you, if you had the opportunity, what would you tell your 18-year-old self?
Oh dear. Well, as I've hinted, I wouldn't have spent 21 years at Specsavers. I got in a comfort zone. I would 100% be telling myself that same bit, is move on every 3 to 5 years. You'll recognize your own value much, much quicker, and you will seek out stretch challenges in new roles much, much quicker, as well as a consequence of doing that. Yes, it might, make family life a little bit uncomfortable at times. But if you've got, particularly if you've got an ambition at some stage to work for yourself, then I think moving on regularly is something that you probably really, really need to consider.
Yeah, that's a great piece of advice. I think, as you said, in your current role, you're selling yourself every day versus, selling yourself once every 20 years or every 5 years. So it's just thinking about, I guess, that cadence and, keeping on top of things. So, yeah, no, that's been a really good piece of advice. And I think, it's been really insightful learning, from your journey, and you describing, what you went through different steps in your career. So it's really been valuable, and I've gotten some good insight out of it, and I'm sure the listeners will as well. But I mean, just before we end off, to perhaps ask you a couple of short questions, is there any specific book you might recommend? What you said, you do a lot of reading. Is there anything that springs to mind that?
Oh yeah, yeah. There's a book. I can't think who the author is, but there's a book. It's called Sumo.
Sumo.
SUMO, and it's Shut Up, Move On, and it's very much around influence, and all around this fact that there are certain things that you can control and other things that you can't. And it's really, really important to you personally to understand and recognize the difference between the two. So that's a book that I keep, I will go back to. And then I'm a bit of got a bit of a soft spot for emotional intelligence.
I don't think that's a bad thing.
So any book on emotional intelligence, I quite like. I guess there's a bit of psychology in me, and those kind of things. Again, it's influencing ultimately at the end of the day, EQ. So those are the kind of books that I go back to. I like the other books I love are actually autobiographies from business leaders. So I read Christmas this year, I read the book about Nike and how Nike grew into the organization.
It's Shoe Dog, I think. Is it Shoe Dog?
That's the one.
Phil Knight, yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. I couldn't put it down.
Yeah, that's always a good recommendation. So, certainly what I'll do is I'll look up the Sumo book. I'll post on the show notes that I write up afterwards. I'll post the link to that book on Amazon anyway. So figure out who the author is. So that's brilliant. Thanks for sharing that. And I guess the last question then is, where can people find out more about you or more about HITS?
Good question. I'm glad you gave me that opportunity. So the company has a website, which is www.hitsconsultancy.com. I'm obviously on LinkedIn, and probably not as regular as I should be, but I like to put some postings on LinkedIn around what's happening in the IT world, especially in the retail context. That's how you can find out about me. And please drop me a note on LinkedIn. Love to chat to people. Always interested in organizations and how I might be able to help them, especially SMEs.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. Thanks for that offer. And what I'll do is I'll post a link in the show notes again to hitsconsultancy.com and also to your LinkedIn profile, so users can find that, or listeners can find that easily and get in touch with you.
Great. Thank you. Really enjoyed it.
Well, Peter, thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. It's been an awesome chat, and just so much insight. And I think just thanks again for sharing your story.
My absolute pleasure. I can't believe we've been talking for the best part of an hour. It's just flown by.
It does. It goes quickly. So yeah, I know I'm eating into your evening, but I really do appreciate it, and I'm sure the listeners appreciate it too. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Well, as Peter just said in the chat, an hour really does go by very quickly. And so another great interview. I'm really grateful for Peter joining me. I really do appreciate the time, as I'm sure our listeners do too. And as usual, I'd like to wrap up with a few takeaway and a few key takeaways and a few thoughts from the interview. Typically, as we go through the interview, I jot down notes and then, post the interview, listen to it back. And I'm astounded by just the sort of list of things I've drawn out here. Every one I've kind of gone and underlined with a highlighter. So I'm just going to cover off some of the key things that stood out to me and go through those. I think I'll share them as usual, share them in the show notes as well. And I think the first thing that Peter had said was he talked about, not necessarily starting his career in IT by intent. It was kind of more landing in it by accident. But what he drew out from that was the sort of key balance between IT and business skills. And I think regardless of the industry you find yourself in, whether you are a business strategist or an IT specialist, whatever it is, having that breadth of skills to understand both worlds serves you incredibly well. So regardless of your career choice or your career path, I think having a balance of those sorts of skills is really key. He again touched on learning, and of course this is one of the themes that we look to draw out on the Agile Career podcast. And again, he talked about learning a sufficient amount of detail in order to understand something correctly and advise on it. So I can't remember which episode it was, but we certainly talked about that same learning approach. So again, a really good takeaway there. The reason he landed in IT that Peter spoke about was the opportunity that he had to join a stock management function or a project that was rolling out a new stock management system. And I think the key thing here is really just to draw out the fact that when you are presented with these sorts of opportunities, while they might be outside of your key area of responsibility, they might be outside of your comfort zone or outside of your skill set, take these opportunities by the horn, because they often present much bigger opportunities and broader opportunities down the line. They give you an ability to develop your skills. They give you an ability to broaden your experience, broaden your network. There's so many things that come along with taking these opportunities. So keep an eye out for these opportunities and put your hand up when they come along. Peter talked about the role of a business analyst. Again, this is a really good the way that Peter described the role, some really good insight into the role of a business analyst and the opportunities that it unlocks. Of course, the role of a business analyst is pretty broad and can be applied in many situations. Again, a sort of good career path to take, especially earlier on in your career, just because it unlocks so many opportunities. I asked about the sorts of approaches that Peter took to developing his skills. He mentioned reading, which I think most of us are familiar with. I mean, we're all familiar with reading, but many of us do use that to improve and better our skills. It has, of course, come up in a number of interviews. Networking as well, and I think the really key thing here was that Peter dropped into a lot of detail around networking. He talked about attending a number of webinars, which again I think we all do, but dinners as well, having sit-down dinners face-to-face, meeting new people, networking, talking more about what it is you do, understanding more about other people's problems. Something that he said really took him out of his comfort zone, but something that has served him incredibly well. In terms of learning, he also talked about accepting the things that you don't know and being able to ask for help. Again, really sage advice. And next, the thing that I'd like to draw out is, again, around skills development, and not necessarily functional skills, but those sort of leadership skills. So as Peter took us through his career, he took on more and more responsibility, I guess kind of moving from a lot of doing, moving into a management role and ultimately a leadership role. And he said the strange thing for him, or the challenging thing sometimes, was, you go from working with your colleagues to managing your colleagues and ultimately leading your colleagues. And of course, there's challenges that come with that. He talked about getting the best out of people and being able, as a leader, to adapt to people's individual styles. So what may work well for one person might not work well for another. It's being able to spot that difference and I think adapt your style accordingly to really get the best out of people. And Peter called it a personal touch and related it directly to relationship building. When I asked the question of, looking back, what was your sort of biggest surprise? And Peter said, I was surprised by how much I knew, but equally so, that was something that got him thinking about, what was his worth and what did he know, taking stock of his current situation. And this was on the cusp of him moving from that corporate role to establishing his own consultancy and going solo. So I think, this goes back to a number of episodes where, again, we've spoken about taking stock of your current situation, understanding what it is, what your valuable skills are, and how you can use those skills to progress and to move your career and to move yourself forward. Peter spoke about empathy as well. We said not to be confused with sympathy, because ultimately you still need to be able to deliver and get things done. But empathy is important, very important, I think. And again, sort of back to skills development and networking, Peter spoke about Roundtable, which is a social charity organization. And they're obviously too much to discuss right now, but what I will do is I'll share the link in the listener notes. So please go out and find out more about Roundtable or any other service organization like Rotary or Lions. Invaluable opportunities to develop your skills, to develop your network. I can't sing the praises of these organizations enough. Peter said about moving into his own or being self-employed, don't be scared. It does appear scary at first, but don't be scared. As long as you focus on some of the key things like learning to market yourself, learning to live with being uncomfortable. So putting yourself outside of your comfort zone and being able to live with being uncomfortable. The interesting thing he said about marketing yourself and about posting things on social media, be they LinkedIn or Twitter, is that, can you look at what you've posted and say, does that represent who you are, and will it come across well when people look at it? So again, considering the importance of social media and using social media correctly. And Another interesting point was he said you should look at changing your career or changing jobs every 5 years. And he only noticed this when, in retrospect, looking back and seeing that he'd been at one organization for over 20 years. And that's not to say everyone should look at doing that. You need to understand, I think, what works well for you. But I think certainly do take stock of your situation at regular intervals and say, am I still in the right place? Are my skills being developed? Am I being challenged? Am I getting enjoyment from what I'm doing? Of course, if the answer is yes, then, stay there, don't move. But, take the opportunity to ask yourself those questions. And I think finally then Peter ended off with making the point of moving out your comfort zone and, giving yourself those sort of stretch goals and being challenged. And I think, certainly a lot to take away in an hour of the interview. So I've summarized those as best I can. I guess when I listen to the show again, there will be more that comes out. So hopefully it's been very valuable for you and you've taken away lots of good advice. Again, I'll write these all up in the show notes and share them alongside the show. And finally, again, just say thank you to Peter for joining us. Really grateful for the time he gave and for the insight he shared. And also to you listeners for joining and giving your time as well. I do appreciate time is a really limited commodity, and choosing to listen to a podcast for an hour means you can't do something else. So I really appreciate your time and you joining me on this journey that we're taking together. I look forward to talking to you again in the next episode. So take care, and I will speak to you soon.